Adam Schiff, the congressman from the 28th Congressional District, a good personal friend, I'm proud to say, is one of the very most effective members of the Congress. He's a member of both the powerful House Appropriations Committee, which is where the rubber meets the road in terms of establishing and following up on national priorities. And he's also a member of the Permanent Committee on Intelligence, which oversees both the nation's intelligence agencies and our intelligence operations. And I think that when you remember appointed to two committees like this, it's an indication of the kind of respect that Adam Schiff has among his colleagues. As a state senator, prior to his election to Congress, he chaired both the state Senate Judiciary and Juvenile Justice Committees. For those of us in LA, by the way, he also wrote the legislation establishing the Gold Line. As a deputy U.S. attorney prior to his service in the state Senate, he successfully prosecuted the first FBI agent ever indicted for espionage. He truly is, and I think his committee chairmanships, first in the state Senate and now in the Congress, is a clear indication of his importance and respect. Congressman Adam Schiff.
Conway, thank you very much. It's such a delight to be with you all here today, and as you saw, I had to switch seats from that side to this side. It reminded me of the old Monty Python gag where they have two people seated on stage, one who's seated under a bright light and one who's seated in the dark. And the interviewer says to the person who's seated in the light, so I understand you're in the witness protection program. And if the mob were to find out who you were, your life wouldn't be worth anything. Is that right? Oh, I'm sorry. I think you're supposed to be sitting over there. Well, I don't know whether I'm sitting in the light or the dark seat today, but it's a delight to be with you all. And I want to, at the outset, thank Maryvale and Steve Gunther for being our hosts. You'll hear more about Steve in a minute and the organization, but we're honored with an extraordinary panel today. And I want to thank members of GRACE, the National Foster Youth Institute, and my wonderful colleague, Karen Bass, who is just the most tremendous advocate for foster youth and a fabulous member of Congress for putting together this event today and inviting us. I know you all have a background in child welfare, the social services field. Some of you may be caseworkers, work in administration or support services for foster youth, or helping to care for foster youth on your own, and we're so grateful for all the work that you do. You're part of a system that looks after the most vulnerable in our society, and I've always felt that we'll be measured as a society by how we look after those who are most in need, and this is sort of ground central, the audience that we have here today. So thank you for all that you've done. I remember the first meeting I had as a legislator on a foster youth issue was with the California Youth Connection. Do we have any folks from the California Youth Connection that are here today? It's a wonderful organization, former foster youth, and I was very struck. They came to lobby me on a bill. I think it was one of the most effective lobbying visits I've ever had, and it was quite revelatory to me because what they told me was that when they graduate and go on to college and finish their first year in college, they often have no home to go back to. The foster care relationship with their family sometimes continues, and often it doesn't. And they came to pitch me on the idea that the foster care payments could continue to the emancipated youth while they were enrolled in school and maintained a certain GPA, so that they'd have a way of providing for themselves. And particularly have a place to live when the college semester came to an end. And that was really kind of a revelation that, and it shouldn't have been, but it was, to somebody who wasn't that familiar with the foster care system, that sometimes when the foster care payment to the family ends, the relationship ends. And the struggles that these young people had to go through. Since then I've done a lot to educate myself about the system, and have had some interesting town halls for foster youth and learned about the whole extraordinary variety of challenges, and probably none more acute than those that are in a group home setting. So I'm very eager to hear from our panelists today about some of the changing nature of the challenges facing foster youth, particularly in a group home setting, how we can continue individualized attention and care in that setting, how we can deal with some of the neighborhood issues that come up, how we can deal with the challenges in terms of mental health care in a time when mental health care services have been on the decline in terms of our budget. Some extraordinary challenges, and we couldn't have a better group here with us today to answer that call and talk about some of the key reforms that are going on in Los Angeles, some of the pilot projects, and whether they're bearing fruit, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. We have a strong bipartisan caucus in Congress on foster care with the leadership of people like my colleague Jim McDermott, who I see in the rear, and Karen Bass and others who do an extraordinary job. We have a wonderful opportunity to bring in more and more members through the opportunity to have foster care youth spend some time shadowing us. And I know you heard from Tiffany Boyd, one of our wonderful foster youth advocates, and I understand now a candidate for governor, which is very exciting. It's about time that we had a former foster youth in the governor's office in the leadership role there. So, but as we are still trying to get some funding from the current governor, we may want to keep that under the down low for the moment. But let me tell you a little bit about our panelists, and then I'd like to invite them each to give some brief opening remarks about the challenges they're facing or some encouraging developments. But the first is Ken Berrick. He is the founder and CEO of the Seneca Center for Children and Families, a nonprofit agency that provides school-based, community-based, and residentially based services for children with serious emotional issues and for their families. Ken is a member of the California Child Welfare Council and a co-author of the book Unconditional Care, Relationship-Based Behavioral Intervention with Vulnerable Children and Families. We're also joined on the panel by Steve Gunther, MSW LCSW, President and Executive Director of Maryvale. He's been here since 2009. Working with a dedicated and talented team, he is helping to shape the next chapter in the agency's 155-year history, including the expansion of programs and services. Most notably, he helped complete a 10-year vision with the opening of the new Family Resource and Early Education Center located in Duarte. We're also joined by Leslie Ann Hay, founder and principal of Hay Consulting. Leslie Ann brings over 20 years of experience working in the human services field. She's been a consultant and trainer to health and human service agencies at the county and state and federal levels, specializing in child welfare services, welfare to work programs, and Medicaid. She also served as lead consultant for the California Residential-Based Services Pilot Program. Carroll Schroeder is one of our panelists, Executive Director in California Alliance of Child and Family Services, a statewide association representing accredited private nonprofit organizations serving California's most vulnerable children, youth, and families. During Carroll's tenure, the Alliance has successfully sponsored AB 1453. We'll hear more about the Residentially Based Services Reform Initiative, co-sponsored Prop 63, the Mental Health Services Act, and co-sponsored AB 12 and succeeding bills extending foster care benefits to youth up to the age of 21. We'll hear from Dr. Charles Sophy, Medical Director, LA County Department of Children and Family Services. He practices child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry in Beverly Hills, California, and has appeared on numerous national television and radio broadcasts, including the Dr. Phil Show, the Dr. Oz Show, and the Today Show. He's also the author of Side by Side, the revolutionary mother-daughter program for conflict-free communication. So that's our wonderful panel. If you could give them a round of applause to welcome them. And why don't we start with Dr. Charles Sophy and share a few quick thoughts with us and before we go to the other panelists.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you for having us here today. It means a lot to me to be able to speak from the inside out. I see a lot of stuff that many people don't see but perceive from the outside when a placement doesn't work, mental health doesn't work, etc. And my general thoughts today to start our discussion are very simple things, because I think we tend to make things very, very complicated. These are children and these are families that we are living next door to, we are communicating with, and there's no reason why we can't work it through to help them through a rough time in their life. So I think the problem begins with us trying to take a system and some funding barriers and make that a machine to parent children and to keep families safe, and that will never work. So until we humanize a lot more of it from the inside out of the system, then we're never really going to meet the needs of human beings. I also think that it's very fear-based system from our provider standpoint, and everyone is so frightened by the fact that they may get in trouble because they don't treat the right way or it doesn't meet the right medical necessity or the criteria, that many children and many families who could get the right treatment, because it's right there, don't get it because of the fear of either an audit or the interpretation or the lack of what medical necessity really is. So I think from a medical and a mental health standpoint, we're really not giving services that we should and could be giving. It's just because of a barrier of interpretation. I also think that there's a lot of fear-based within our work system in DCFS. We don't take on the fact that they are, again, human beings we're connecting with, and even though we may be angry at a mom or a dad who's a drug addict, they could be our brother, our sister, it could be us. And so being able to get past that fear and reach to people on a regular basis and a consistent basis is another big issue that we have to face. So those are the kinds of things that we and I, through a lot of pilots and a lot of looking deeply into high-risk cases and frequent flyers, as we say in DCFS, we are learning and hopefully going to do things very differently. Thank you.
Charles, thank you. Carroll.
Thank you for inviting us and for having us here. It's a delight to be at Maryvale. I've been in this position for 12 years. Maryvale's a member agency of the California Alliance, and while I've been to their Family Resource Center in Duarte, I've never been to this campus. It's really a beautiful setting. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Residentially Based Services Reform Initiative that was originally sponsored by the Alliance and then has been worked on by lots of groups, many of whom are represented here today. I want to, just for a second, I want to say one thing about congregate care and the concept of getting services in a group setting. There's nothing magic about that. The services and support, the treatment and therapies that you can get in a residential setting can be gotten anywhere. And the question is, one of those kids who for some period of time, for some reason, need to get their care and supervision and nurturing in this kind of setting, in a residential setting, and what we do with, for, and on behalf of those kids. In about 2004, 2005, we began this initiative because we realized, based on talking with former foster youth, talking with our own members, talking with counties, that what we were doing in terms of residential care was not working overall. You could certainly find instances in which kids had had incredibly good services, things that turned out well for them and so on, but as a system it wasn't working. There were lots of problems, and I don't want to go into that. But what I do want to say is that one of the things that we focused on that was really key was getting rid of this notion that residential services are like a black box that kids go into, the door closes, families, friends, everybody remains outside while some sort of magic occurs within the black box, only for the door to open some 12, 18, 24 months later, boink, and this young person emerges, changed, transformed, goes back to the community, and everything's fine and dandy. It was never true. It's not true now. It didn't work. It doesn't work now. And so the question in RBS reform was, for those young people who for some period of time need to be in a residential setting, first, how is that decision made? And then what do you do to make that actually work? And the biggest thing that let me start with how you make that decision, because one of the things we looked at was, are there specific behaviors on the part of that young person that would preclude them from living in the community? And one of the things that the young people made clear to us is, don't put this all on us. A lot of this has to do with what you can provide for us in the community as well as it does with us. And so we turned that back. It's that entire group of, oh gosh, some 30 people, stakeholders from around the state, again, including many people who are in this room. And we said, how do you make that decision? And it was in the context of the child and family team, together with good assessment, that the decision would have to be made. So not being made by a single caseworker or made by a caseworker and their supervisor, or by a single foster parent or whatever, but that it would be made in the context of the team, which includes that young person and his or her family members. So then the question is, if in fact the decision is made that that's the case, that there needs to be a period of residentially based services, then how do we, what kinds of services do we need to assure that that young person can get back into the community, can get back into family as quickly as possible? And we really came up with 7. I'll give them to you real quickly. The first is intensive and immediate family finding and engagement. So rather than locking families out of the residential process, the question is, how do we incorporate them and bring them in as quickly as possible? And how do we make sure that they stay engaged the entire process, because that's where that young person's going when they leave, whether it's to reunification with birth family, or whether it's to another family member, or whether it's into an adoptive kind of setting, but how do we make sure that those folks are there? Secondly, that there needs to be a great deal of intensive coordinated care coordination, because the more challenging the situation, the greater the risk, the greater the need for integration and coordination of services. Third, a transformation of the residential environment away from keeping kids, raising kids for long periods of time, to returning kids, to reducing lengths of stay and returning kids to the communities as quickly as possible, but also for extensive family inclusion, so that families become a part of the residential setting just as much as the kids and the staff and so on are. Fourth, flexible staffing, permitting staff to move with kids into and out of the community, so that the folks who provide the services and support to you in the residential setting move with you into the community and help you get established there and wrap services and support around you and the family to assure your safety and success there. Fifth, individualized, evidence-informed, evidence-based practices aimed at addressing the treatment and therapeutic needs of the young person. Sixth, the capacity to provide crisis response and continuity of care wherever that young person is. And seventh, follow along support services, treatment, and therapies, so that rather than discharging young people out a door, patting them on the back, giving them their clothes in a black plastic bag, and saying good luck, we follow the young people into the community and continue to wrap those services around. So the whole point here, as you can see, is that residential care, rather than being this thing that kids go to, rather than being the destination, becomes the train. It becomes the means of moving kids back into the community and keeping them in the community as well as we can. Now, it took a while. We doing okay time-wise?
Actually,
I'll stop.
You should probably stop.
I will stop.
You
can't tell me to stop. I already stopped.
I'm going to... Can we turn off that microphone, please? I'm going to come back to you for the first question, so okay. Save a little of your material. Sure. But let me finish the introductions. And do you go by Leslie Ann or Leslie? Leslie Ann. Okay, I thought so. Leslie Ann.
Thank you. I'm going to make this brief. I'm going to try to do that. Carroll.
Why do you look at me?
I know, because we're buddies. I can say that to you. But thank you so much for having me be here today. I feel very privileged to be on this panel with such wonderful colleagues. But I had the privilege of actually playing a consulting role in putting what Carroll just laid out so beautifully as a simple 7-step set of ideas into action. And that's a little bit harder to do than to say. And I think the thing I want to just lead with as we frame this conversation today is that we have created some significant systems to try and respond to this ever-pressing problem of children who have lost their families is fundamentally what's happened here. And we are trying to get them on a journey to be reunited and rebuild those families around them. And so the guiding light that we used in trying this experiment of can we transform congregate care in a few locations in California and see what we learn was that we had to keep that beacon in front of us all the time. And in fact, we didn't do very well for the first couple of years, I have to say. We got a little bit tangled up in everybody's individual interests and the resistance to change around what it meant to dismantle the system as it existed so far, and really trying something new and committing to something new. And you know what brought us back to our senses was the voice of the youth. It was when we started to listen better to what it was that we were really trying to do. The youth helped us stop, sort of set aside our conversations about resources and expectations and interests, and really get back to permanency and belonging and the kinds of things that we're trying to create for children and their families. So I'd like to talk a little bit later as we go around to talk about some of the lessons learned from the 4 demonstration sites in 4 different counties in California, where we actually kind of created an experiment where we were able to loosen the grip of our current system and create some more flexibility and try out some things on a temporary basis to see if we can operate differently and to see what kinds of results we can get when we do that. So that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit later.
Good. Thank you very much. Steve?
Thank you. We've been trying to turn Carroll's mic off for a long time.
Well, I think the problem is that he didn't get the memo that said you can make 6 points in your introduction, but you can't go beyond 6.
First of all, I would just like to officially welcome all of you to campus. It's wonderful to have you here and to have you take the time out of what I'm sure are very busy lives and schedule to be here today and to be a part of this conversation. I arrived here in early 2009, and at that time I sat down with quite a number of the staff and just tried to listen and talk to folks about what their experience was and what their hopes and dreams were here at Maryvale. And I think what I heard is informative for us today, because really 2 things came out of those conversations from some incredible people who are committed day in and day out to the work that they do. One, they said loud and clear that the needs of our kids are changing. And I won't speak a great deal about that because I know Ken's is gonna speak to that. But the needs of the kids that were coming to Maryvale and to other programs like ours were changing. The second thing I heard from them was, we don't feel equipped to meet the needs of those kids. So 2 things that I think are really important, or a few things that I think are really important in the conversation. First of all, we have to, I think, continue to acknowledge and be willing to acknowledge that there is a place and a role for residential care in this continuum. And I think in some quarters there are those that would say, and hey, I'll be the first to support if we can get to that place where we don't need to have intensive residential care for kids. But until we get there, we have to, I think, first of all, accept that there is a place for that, and then we have to figure out how we're going to provide that service and what that service looks like, how to equip our staff to serve that need, and most importantly, to always remember that the goal is to return the child, first of all, to their family. If we keep that in mind, and if everything we do points in that direction, we can be successful. When I got into this work many years ago, and I stopped counting, it was that child, as Carroll said, child would come into the program, and oftentimes the family and the parents were excluded. They were, in many cases, demonized, and we had the answers. We had the answer. We don't have all the answers. The children have the answers. Their family have the answers. We have part of the answer. We have to bring all folks, everybody together in that conversation, which leads to my final point. In order for us to be successful in that shorter-term care that we need to be providing to help stabilize children at a point in time in their life where they may need a setting like this, they may need the kinds of resources that we can bring to them for a very short period of time, it becomes very critical for us also to be able to coordinate the various systems that are involved in the life of that child. Whether it's the social services system or the juvenile justice system, whether it's the school system. I can't tell you how many conversations we've been having recently with some of the school districts that we're involved with who are very frustrated, trying to meet the needs of the children that are placed with us and thus with them, not having the resources, not having the information, not having the things that they need. We have to do a better job of making sure that in that process all the systems are working close together. So it's great to have us all here together. I'm certain that this conversation will be as fruitful as the first one we have, and I think by the end of the day we're going to have a lot to think about.
Steve, thank you. Ken?
Thanks. I'm going to talk really fast, partly because I do not want to argue with a member of the United States Congress over my time. That just seems like a bad idea.
First of all, any politician telling anyone they're speaking too long is definitely the pot calling the kettle black. So I don't have any credibility on this issue.
Well, also, had I known you were a member of the Intelligence Committee, I would have prepared smarter remarks. But
Actually, I already know the remarks you're going to make.
Okay. Let me jump right in. Okay, thanks. Thanks for having us here, and thanks for hosting what I think is turning into and going to become a start of something really important. We're in a really rapidly changing system, and that system has changed because we realized we were doing something wrong. You know, I tell my 11-year-old son, making the mistake isn't the problem. It's continuing the mistake after you realize it's a mistake. And that's what we're trying to shift here. That's the paradigm we're trying to shift here, is moving from what we didn't know it was wrong. I didn't know it was wrong when Seneca began in 1985, because we were there for one purpose. We were seeing kids. These were kids who were 9, 10, 11, 12 years old that had been failed by 10, 12, 14 placements. And those kids were coming to us with the kinds of attachment problems that you would expect when someone tells you you've lost your home over and over and over again, right? And the kids would come to us, and they didn't say, my placements failed me. They never said that. They said they failed the placement, right? So they came with that sense of failure, that sense of being defeated, and most profoundly, that disrupted attachment. And we now know enough about attachment theory to know what that does, right? And so we made decisions, and Seneca was part of a movement to bring intensive treatment foster care in California. And the biggest worry when we brought intensive treatment foster care to California was there would be a proliferation of these homes that would overwhelm the system, right? And in fact, what happened? The biggest need that counties have when I talk to them today is for intensive treatment foster care homes. Because when you premise a system on the availability of saints, you are limited by that availability, right? We're asking people to do something extraordinary, aren't we? To work with kids who have had these experiences time and time again, and traditionally were sent to residential treatment, right? And to bring them into their homes and into their families, which creates an obligation to do what? We've said it over and over again today. You talked about it. That creates a commitment for us to provide the support. So that's one of the tiers of integration that I'm going to talk to you about. We also, when we changed the nature of residential treatment, and we changed it from one single purpose, right? And what that purpose was stability. We wanted to stabilize the child's life. We wanted to create a place where they would not be told they had failed again. And that was our only goal. So when we talk about these long lengths of stay and how damaging they were, and they were damaging, let's be clear. It wasn't with evil intention. It was to say, we want to keep you here. There were loving, caring people in those homes that wanted to engage those kids, but we didn't think about what happens next. And then we realized that we were raising kids in group care. And that led us to intensive treatment foster care. And then we started talking in the context of intensive treatment foster care about what if we could bring these same services, right, the same level of intensity to people's homes? Why can we provide this in the context of a foster home and we can't provide it to an aunt, to an uncle, to a parent? It made no sense. It was unfathomably dumb. That was actually, I'm quoting Carl Dennis from Kaleidoscope, who said, this is unfathomably dumb, right? So we created wraparound, right? And then we started creating these specialized organizations, right? One that did wraparound, another that did foster care, another that did something else. And what did we do? We created instability. We created a necessary placement change, a necessary therapist change, a necessary constellation of support change every time a child progressed. Right? Unfathomable. Like, what are we thinking here? So now we need to start thinking about how do we take these systems and integrate them into comprehensive systems of care. And when you look at RBS, it creates part of the capability. How am I doing? I have 1 more minute?
About 1 more minute.
Make him stop.
As we
Make-
talk
make
about
him
the role of
stop.
residential treatment, I just want to tell you about one more thing.
You're entering Carroll territory here. I just want you to know.
When we think about residential treatment, we've traditionally thought about it in milieu-based settings, right, that require kids to become part of a group. But if we want to shorten lengths of stay, we want the primary attachment to be the adults that are providing the treatment. So that's led us to smaller and smaller settings to think about residential treatment in an entirely different way. In San Francisco, we're about to pilot a program that's going to effectively be a hospital for 2 kids. Not more than 2 kids ever. Think about that. How much can we shorten lengths of stay when those 2 kids are getting the full attention of the entire treatment team for that 30, 60, 90 days? You like that idea, don't you? The other thing, Alameda County created a project where kids who were going to the psychiatric hospital instead came to a 23-hour assessment center that Seneca operates. They are never in a waiting room. They are greeted at the door, and they are in individual care from the moment they walk in. They don't wait for 1 minute ever, and they are never with a group of kids. In our community treatment facility, which is now closed, we had as many as 200 restraints in a year. And that was serving 18 of kids that were really the most struggling kids in California. In this 23-hour assessment center that's serving kids in acute crisis, we served 1,600 kids. We had 12 kids that had to be held, and typically for less than 5 minutes at a time. So that's what you can do when you individualize treatment and when you create these integrated systems, and I better be quiet. So thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Carol, I want to go back to you, a couple questions. One is, compared to 10 years ago, we have about half the youth in group homes now. What's the phenomena behind those numbers? And second, you mentioned individualized 3 times to underscore its importance. How do we achieve that in a group home setting?
Let me start with the first. We have reduced the number of kids. I know that Barbara said that the rates haven't come down very much. We've actually reduced the numbers of kids in residential care by half. As a percentage of kids, total kids in foster care, it's remained about the same. So that reduction is to some extent a reflection of fewer kids in foster care, because I will tell you that a vast number, I don't know if it's a majority, because we don't have the data on this, but many, many kids who are in residential settings are there because they have been in other settings any number of times. You rarely see a young person who comes into care and goes immediately into a residential setting. As Ken said, first, a whole variety of other living situations have failed them. And by the time they get into a residential setting, it's almost a default thing. We don't know what else to do. We put the kid in a residential setting. And so I hope what it is a reflection that we're doing a much better job earlier on in reducing not so much the number of kids coming in, because I think Barbara's numbers show that the number of kids coming into care has remained pretty flat, but in moving kids out of care more quickly and into permanent settings. Certainly the focus of RBS reform is on permanency and establishing permanency for those kids that permanency has eluded for a long time. We've also gotten very good at creating other types of community-based alternatives, such as not just intensive treatment foster care, but wraparound and therapeutic behavioral services and intensive case management services, which I think have been enormously useful in that. So we've done the right things in terms of building the alternatives, so fewer and fewer kids have to need that kind of setting or need to get their services and support in those kinds of settings. What was your other question? You asked me another one. Individualized. Somebody said once, they don't call it group care for nothing, meaning that generally speaking, the means of operation in residential settings has been a group kind of thing, and kids are engaged as groups, and therapy and treatment and services are delivered as groups. But as we get into this and we begin, the question becomes, how do you begin to individualize those things to the specific needs of individual kids and families, as opposed to a sort of one-size-fits-all, and if you don't quite fit into the program, well, then you got to leave the program. And the answer to that is precisely what we've talked about here, and that is that you begin to work with each young person individually and with that young person's family individually toward the goal that they have collectively, and then you begin to tailor what you have, and then you move those things into the community with that young person. And so if you're really doing it right, there are probably more kids that you're working with in the community at any given time who are living in the community than are occupying a bed in your campus facility or in a group setting.
Carroll, thank you. Leslie, you mentioned in your comments some success we're having with pilot programs. Can you tell us a little about that?
Absolutely. So we've been operating RBS now for, almost 3 years in 4 different counties throughout California. And I think some of the takeaways in terms of what we've been learning with this is not only that idea of sort of opening up the black box and making sure that we're not looking at residential treatment as sort of the last resort, but we're really looking at it as a much more planful kind of assessment that is a support to families, right? If you're caring for a child who really does have intensive behavioral needs and needs that kind of intensive therapeutic intervention, that's something you don't want to restrict from families. But what you don't want to do is put that child in that setting and then forget about the fact that you're doing this for their family connection in the long run. And so that's what we did with RBS, is to really think about that family and child together, or if there's not a family connected to that child right now, that's the very first thing you do, is start looking for that child's family. And you'll hear conversations about children or youth who've maybe had multiple placements and the sense of multiple failure. And you hear people starting to say, this child will never be able to live in a family. Do you ever hear that in your case meetings? Or this child has no family. And what we found when we really started looking closely at it is that that's just not true, frankly, that every child has family. They may not have the original parents that, they were born into for various reasons and circumstances, but they have relatives. They have relatives that may not even know about that child. They have siblings. Sometimes they have older siblings that are already adults now. They have cousins. They have second cousins. They have all kinds of people that, if we use some of our technology that we have available now today to use that more deliberately, to go out and identify those families, reach out to them, because those folks have been disconnected for a long, long time in a lot of ways, right? And they need to be invited in and welcomed in. So that was one of the other transformational things that the RBS sites did, is they started to make the residential setting a welcoming place for families. In other words, it wasn't the place where you come through a gate and you have to knock on the locked door, but there's maybe a family connection center that's now built on site, which is like a home or an apartment or a suite, if you will, that family can come and stay with that child for extended lengths of time. Not only to see the child and connect with them, but to practice new behaviors and new ways of relating to each other. So it's bringing that therapeutic milieu and extending it beyond just focusing on the child and their behaviors, because the other thing we found is that many of those disruptive behaviors are generated out of a sense of loss, right? And a sense of multiple detachments and broken relationships throughout the course of their experience. And so once you start answering that question that the kids often continue to ask, which is, when can I see my aunt? Or when can I get back together with my sister or my brother or whoever? And so it was creating those opportunities to be able to do that, and not thinking of the residential setting as sort of, this will finally be the place where you will belong, because kids don't belong permanently in group institutional settings, right? They belong in families. And so I think being able to open up those walls, if you will. And I think in Los Angeles, as a matter of fact, they called it, what was the name of the program there in terms of intervention without walls? I mean, it was about the whole idea of bringing down the walls of what had traditionally been the kind of culture and environment that had gotten reinforced, and the system had reinforced it as well.
And Charles, can you share a little bit about the experience here in LA and what we've seen?
I think, unfortunately, we see oftentimes that we've made a child require that level of care. They've come in, they're an innocent child in a situation that maybe either got blown out of proportion or wasn't really, the bleeding wasn't stopped early on, either because it wasn't diagnosed. I hate to sound like a doctor, but I am. And we should be able to identify the problem and really put the fixes in that living room in the middle of the night. If we have a community and we're human and we're all going to jump in, but unfortunately we don't get there, and then we have a child who's bumping around and then ends up on that level of care needing a group setting. But like you said, most behaviors, 7 out of 10 kids that have that kind of egregious behavior that require that kind of containment is their way to speak out that I just want my life back on some level. So that's what we're seeing. And so we're taking a lot of these cases apart, and we're going back and looking for families. And many of our workers and many of us are finding that we thought we called somebody, but we didn't call them, and they never heard from us, and they've been waiting to hear from us. And so there is a family member many times there.
Thank you. Ken, can you tell us a little bit about how the pilot program has been working at Seneca that Lesley-Ann was referencing?
Sure. It's actually had a very challenging start. I think switching paradigms was difficult, and I think there was this wall. This is the residential component of our program. This is the family-based component of our program. And when you graduate from the residential program, then you get to move to family. And we had to shift the thinking of everybody involved. Not just our team was pretty ready to shift, but we had a county team that was very engaged with the program and had to shift with us. So I think the biggest challenge is this lack of overall resources when we get to that 1% or 2% of youth that have such a profound mental illness or are struggling so much that they really need a constellation. And just to elaborate on what Carroll was saying earlier, in 2003 we had 11,300 kids in group care. 2013, 6,200. 74% reduction in kids 6 to 10, and a 32% reduction in 16 to 18-year-olds. And this is the bigger statistic, and we talk about group care, but we don't talk about the rest of the system. Metropolitan State Hospital, Napa State Hospital, those beds are eliminated. There has been an overall reduction in hospital beds for kids of about 800 system-wide. So when you get that youth that's in really acute crisis, those reductions, by the way, are generally quite good. We did the right thing. We just didn't replace those things with more durable services like mobile response, like treatment foster care on steroids, where you can actually bring one-to-one 24/7 support to that treatment foster care. So those are the places where we've run into bumps as we've really tried to build out the RBS idea to a very comprehensive intervention system. And there are also the system changes both at a national and a state level that have to be implemented in order to support foster parents and families to be able to help kids through the most difficult times in their lives.
Steve, there are few places that have a longer institutional history than Maryvale. What are the challenges that you faced over the last few years, and what's your prognosis for how things look going forward?
Well, I think that what's been shared so far has really, I think, captured the challenge that we're all facing. I mean, I would echo what Ken is saying, is that as I listened to my staff when I first arrived, that group of kids that has that highest need, that highest level, and not wanting to have to be in a situation where you have to call in for a crisis team and to hospitalize, but in some instances, that may be the only alternative that's left. We've been working very closely with the county, with Dr. Sophy's group in particular, around, with one, I'm thinking one young lady right now in particular, that's been really challenging in terms of meeting her needs. I think she's had a significant history of abuse and neglect, and one of the most difficult cases that I'm aware of, even in my career. But it's taken that effort of really thinking about what does she need, what is it going to take. It's taken a commitment on the part of the county. It's taken a commitment on the part of our staff that has not always been easy, that has really challenged and taxed them in many ways. But it's been very helpful in that process, knowing that they had the support of the county in that process. And we've had to do some things that, you know, this child has got one-on-one care continually since the time she's been here. And she will continue to need that for the foreseeable future. But there is a commitment and an effort to try to figure out what is going to be the next step for her. So I think it's that willingness to work outside of the constraints that sometimes exist to say, you know what, that's not good enough. That's not going to help this child. And so we have to then be willing to go beyond that. And I think that, you know, the challenge, I mean, this is what the RBS project, I think, is bringing forward more and more, is, you know, the difficulties that exist sometimes when you have funding streams and other things in place that don't allow easily for those things to happen. So it takes then a commitment on the part of, and the creativity on the part of, whether it's at the county or organizations like ours that happen to be in a position where maybe we can go that extra step or do things that maybe others are not able to do that.
How much longitudinal evidence do we have about any of these approaches, in the sense that we may know something about how successful they are in the residential program, or how quickly they can be, foster youth can be reunited with family members, but what do we know about what takes place later, after emancipation, about the long-term consequences of what we do in the residential programs? Have we been looking at long enough to tell what works and what doesn't in terms of the long-term impact?
No. Well, it seems like we have, and we should have. Going back to my own experience when I was working in residential care, which goes back far enough that when one of the kids that I work with, David, I was at his birthday the other day, and he just turned 48. And so that's really terrifying to me. Not because he turned 48, because that tells you how old I am. But there's not much longitudinal data on what works with foster kids, period. And you guys who are researchers can talk to me, you can talk more about that. But one of the things we're trying to figure out on the one of the things we know is that from the longitudinal work that's been done on foster kids, particularly in the Midwest study, is that kids who emancipate from foster care usually don't have very good outcomes. And one of the things we know about kids who have been in residential settings is that frequently they emancipate from the residential settings. The idea that kids come into a residential setting and stay there for like 4 years is to a great extent mythical. What we find out tends to happen is that kids come and go and come and go. So they go into a residential setting, then they go back home, and then they go to a foster home, and then they're in shelter care, and then they come back into a residential setting, they go someplace else. And it's that turnover, that churning that Ken was alluding to that's so destructive. Then come 18, and then you get the plastic, you know, the black plastic bags with your clothes, and good luck. So we know that doesn't work. I mean, we're real clear about that. The question is what does, and the best information that we have is that to the extent that we can help a young person and his or her family, however that's defined, create permanency for that young person, assure that they have the services and support that they need in order to meet the needs of that young person and their own needs, and that young person, if in fact that young person has significant mental health needs, gets the mental health treatment and therapies that they need, then we think, and this is our hypothesis, we think that there's a really good chance that not only in the short term will that young person do pretty well, but in the long term they're going to do pretty well as well. And that's what we're trying to look at in the RBS project.
Thank you. We now have questions from the real experts out here in the audience, and let me, talking about your age, Carroll, when I turned 50, like clockwork, my eyes went straight to hell. How can the issue of cross-county community-based services overlap to follow the child if the family is living in another county? Go ahead. Any volunteers?
We're still, the Child Welfare Council and Patrick Gardner within the Child Welfare Council, as well as Sylvia's here, have really continued to work on this. This is an ongoing issue, and it's more of an issue in some jurisdictions than others. And I do think we need much clearer rules and much easier automatic access when a child has a mental health condition in particular, that the service is automatic and that the reimbursement then gets figured out in a back room, and we still haven't gotten there. So I'm glad, and I know that the Welfare Directors Association is looking at this, and we really need a solution to it.
Lysandra, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add, we did actually attempt to create a regional resource for RBS through a Bay Area consortium at the beginning, among all the Bay Area counties to share resources, to, sort of diminish those barriers when a child transfers from one county to another. And we weren't successful simply because the systems are set up in such a way, all the way up to the Board of Supervisors level, even at the federal level, when you think about it, that there's no real expectation for coordination across regions for this in service of children and families and the mobility that we know exists particularly in our urban centers. And so without that sort of construct overarching it was very difficult to move those systems in a new direction. So, I think there's a couple of opportunities for that. One very immediate one is thinking more broadly as you go to redesign your CWS CMS information system to just have information created more permeably throughout the state and across counties so that payments can get made more easily and services can get transferred more easily. But I also think the spirit of collaboration is one that we have to really start to recognize and build into our funding sources, our arrangements around the delivery of services, and really understand that we have to solve this problem together, collectively, across different domains of the support of children and families, not just placement in its own silo, and addressing poverty in another silo, and education in another silo, and mental health in another silo. From the family's perspective, that all comes crashing together under their roof. So I think if we can start to design things from a more family-centric perspective, that could really help things.
Thank you. Charles, did you want to add on?
Yeah, I just think that it's very important that we understand that the ramifications of these kinds of barriers are what re-traumatize kids and break up families, and we recreate an attachment issue. So, yeah, we should all be family, but I can't even get a child health care, plain old health care, and an ER visit without a foster mother or parent having to pay for it because the Medi-Cal from Riverside isn't good in San Bernardino or 2 miles away in LA. So those kinds of things are really, really huge barriers.
Let me go to Carroll.
I just want to say that there's so many issues in this. One is just getting departments within counties to work together can be really challenging sometimes. And I got to give props to LA County on this in terms of their work, particularly between DCFS and mental health. They've made huge strides in that. But just doing that, and I'm hoping that what comes out of KDA, the KDA lawsuit on this, the requirement for there to be, or requirement's too strong a word, the recommendation that there be a group of sort of a joint management structure that takes care of those things, you know, for kids who are in foster care, I think is going to be really helpful. At the Child Welfare Council, we're really looking at two things. One is the cross-county stuff. You know, who's responsible for a child's mental health care, physical health care, and so on, when a child is not living within the county of jurisdiction. And the second is prioritization, which has to do with those things that families and kids need in order to be able to live successfully in the community, and getting them prioritized for those services within their own communities or even within the communities of the others. And I think that in bringing that question up, you brought up, it's the good news is that we have a county-based system that has the opportunity to respond to the local needs of kids and families. The bad news is we have a county-based system that's fragmented into 58 different systems. And so the short answer is we're still working on it.
Let me turn to a different question. Was implicated by the experience that I mentioned from the California Youth Connection. What kind of recommendations would you have for colleges and universities in terms of how they can better serve foster youth? What percentage of colleges and universities would you say even have anything tailored for foster youth? And those that don't, what would you recommend to them?
Let me begin, and a number of schools, I have to acknowledge Dr. Berrick and UC Berkeley, but a number of schools now have specific organizations that support foster youth, and from the time they enter, they're in this supportive system. And I'm most familiar with UC Berkeley's, where the student is assigned a community mentor, the student is helped get into their dorm room, all of those things. And then, of course, at Berkeley, it's so hard for any youth to get in that the number of foster youth is very small, but they're extremely well supported. I know Santa Cruz has something similar. I know many of the Cal State universities have similar things. Those programs, I think, are really crucial because they create a structure within the school where the students are supported from the time they enter. So that's point A. The community colleges also need to act as that transition point, and they need to have similar structures. The Extended Opportunities Program, I think, was initially intended to do that, but it doesn't specifically always meet the needs of foster youth.
Thank you. You know, let me go to another question. I'd like to try to get through as many as we can. Some challenges noted in the group home setting include the desire for some families to engage in treatment, visitation, and ultimately reunification. Can you give some specific examples of how to engage our families in treatment?
No, I think it's very important to be able to have a family know where their child is being placed in the first place. I think it's also important for us to make sure that that child didn't get there because they weren't doing, we didn't do what we should have done and they ended up there. And I think no matter where we are in the DCFS legal process, we should at least be able to have the group home evaluate that family's accessibility, their mental health strengths, their needs, to be able to see if there is some way that we can work with them, even if they're not integrated into the care of the group home at that point for that child, to be able to get stronger than to be connected to the child. So I think at the start of the admission of that child is the start of the look at that family.
Thank you. Yes, did you
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that have to be looked at. I mean, the key is clearly to engage the family in as many ways as possible. So sometimes it's very practical things. Sometimes it's transportation, and if a family has to rely on public transportation to get to a case conference, they may or may not show up, or they may show up on time. So I think that the use of technology, we have the ability now to do things through technology that we couldn't do before. So sometimes a family may not be able to sit in the room, but they can be in the room via phone or video conference or other things. So I think we have to be looking at whatever ways we can bring the family in, just in practical ways. But it really starts with the relationship that you create with the family from the beginning. They have to feel like they are a part of the process, a part of the team. And this kind of goes to what I think the experience was for many of us years and years ago. That wasn't happening. And so we have to create spaces. We have to create a welcome. We have to create an opportunity that brings them in right from the beginning.
And how often is the case that you're in the position of really needing to recommend treatment for the family, apart from the foster youth, so that they can proceed towards reunification? I mean, how often are they already in treatment, getting wraparound services? How often do you have to subtly or not so subtly suggest that they're a big part of the challenge?
I mean, unfortunately, many times the family is nowhere engaged, and even though the child may be in wraparound or whatever, and so it is that initial assessment to pull them in. They have to feel that they're not being punished because they did something and their child is taken from them. Skyping, FaceTime, all of those kinds of things are things that we're starting to talk about in DCFS so that they can be in that room or they can be part of the conversation from the beginning.
And I think the other thing is really thinking about it not so much as a fixing model, but as kind of, that we get in this idea of readiness, right? When is the child ready to go home, or when is the family ready to accept the child? And really, permanency is a process. It's not an event. And it takes a long-term kind of outreach and commitment and practice and renewal. And I think one of the shifts in RBS that has started to happen is not creating interventions within the residential setting that can't be transferred in some format to a home setting. So in other words, things like responding to behavioral stabilization in ways that the family could continue to carry out reasonably. So rather than seclusion rooms and things like that, right, you're looking at other strategies that are transferable to a regular family setting. And again, I think one example I had here of a case where it was a young person who there was this notion that family was not a possibility for this youth. And once they outreach to, engaged, and connected that child to his aunt, it still wasn't all roses, right? They had to have a lot of trial visits and when they had a special position actually called a family specialist that became a role within the residential setting that would be on call and ready to go out when that family was at their wits' end and was trying new things and they weren't working and they didn't know what to do. They could just pick up the phone and their family specialist would be on the other end, and they wouldn't just talk through it on the phone, they would go out there and be in their home for that evening or that next day and be able to work it through and sit down and find alternatives and practice it again. So this expectation that, it's an ongoing learning process that has to be supported because it's new ways of behaving, it's new stressors that will come into the family setting. We all need that kind of support. And then the final stage is transferring that to kind of a natural system of support that doesn't require a formal system to implement, but that there's maybe extended family that's starting to step in and support that family in those same kinds of roles to help them encourage those coping strategies and those new ways of interacting.
Ken?
Well, Leslie talked about entering someone's home, and when we talk about treatment, we need to realize that we're always talking about a combination of social work and treatment. And when we enter someone's home, we are doing exactly that. I talked to my staff many times about if you wouldn't go into someone's home without bringing a cake, don't go into a client's home without bringing a cake. And a failure of engagement is never a failure on the client side. We have to view it as a competition among ourselves to try to engage with families. And it's not hard to understand why. We are still part of the system that took their children away. And then we say, gee, we're having a tough time engaging with this family. Well,
we're here to help.
Right? And so it's a different effort. And I think our schools train us on how to do treatment better than they do train us how to engage and regain some trust so that we can do that treatment.
We have time for just one last question. Should not some foster youth with particularly acute needs be able to go into short-term residential care without having had to first be put in multiple lesser restrictive placements unsuccessfully beforehand?
Yes!
Absolutely.
I want to know where that one came from.
Is that a plant? Oh, since I had a strong reaction? So yeah, here's the deal. The question is, how do we assure that kids get what they need in the amount at which they need it, when they need it, and make sure that it works for them, right? I mean, that's the issue. And right now we've got a fail-up strategy. So you've got to fail, ostensibly until you get what you need. If at the end of that line, a residential setting is what you need. We don't want to be sticking kids in residential settings, willy-nilly because we don't know anything better to do. But if a young person needs a residential setting, regardless of whether they've had one placement, two placements, no placements, then they ought to get what they need at that time. That's a question of assessment and engagement from point one, and that's what we're talking about. I want to get rid of the term placement, because placement should never be something that we do to a child. It should be a question of how do we get together to talk about where this young person is going to live, where they're going to get the care, nurturing, and supervision they need, what are the services and support that everybody needs in order to make this successful, and how do we get the treatments and therapies to them. And let's get rid of the term placement, and then we get rid of the 7-day notice as well.
Well, I have to say, isn't it encouraging we have such thoughtful, compassionate, and intelligent people working in the foster youth system. Thank you so much, all of you. And Steve, again, a particular thank you to you and Maryvale for being our host today. Conway, give it back to you.